I want to thank Dr. Charlie Keel, principal of Innis College, for inviting me to give this talk. Kudos to Shayla Anderson, Innis College alumni relations officer, for coordinating a lot of the details connected to my visit. If I look a little bit back, if I look a little further back, I want to acknowledge Innis Blentic. He's the former development officer at Innis who first suggested over a decade ago that I give a talk.
That's how long it takes us.
Special thanks to Scot Wortley for serving as a discussant for this presentation, Esther Ogunse, the student speaker. Also grateful to everybody who's worked behind the scenes to make this event happen, and of course, all of you for taking the time to attend. I'm glad to see a number of good friends in the audience, and my aunt is in the audience too, which is a special treat. I know that you're missing the Toronto Maple Leafs face-off against the Tampa Bay Lightning tonight, so that makes your presence here all the more meaningful, and it's an honor to be in your company. Naturally, I skipped the first. Okay, so a little bit of bio. It doesn't hurt. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. Charlie did a good academic introduction. I promise to be brief. I grew up in Toronto. I dropped out of high school when I was 17. 4 years later, in 1980, at the age of 21, I completed the pre-university program, now called the Transitional Year Program at Wordsworth College. Walking around the St. George campus at the time, it was impossible to miss the flyers plastered on construction site hoarding and utility poles advertising the screening of free movies sponsored by the Innis College Student Union. I also learned that Innis College offered a program in cinema studies. I dreamed of maybe being a film director, but I also mistakenly thought that I could earn a degree just by watching movies. Perhaps because of my rebellious nature, my aunt can speak to that. If I was going to enroll at U of T, I didn't want to attend university or new college, the schools on the University of Toronto campus that both my parents and my sister graduated from. Instead, I chose Innis. From 1980 to 1985, I attended Innis, graduating with a bachelor's degree, majoring in political science and minoring in psychology. In addition to taking, about a half dozen cinema study courses, I completed several writing classes through the Writing and Rhetoric program. And at the end of the final year enrolled here at Innis, I was honored to receive the Harold Innis Award. During and after my undergraduate studies, I worked close to 4 years, both part-time and full-time, in a correctional facility. On the last day of work, it was about 4 years that I was feeling this way. I swore that I'd have nothing to do with the field of corrections for the rest of my life. Yet here I am today, still talking about prisons, prisoners, and incarceration. Finally, the last time that I was in this hall, I think it was this hall, or maybe there was a similar hall here at Innis. This is it? Okay. Was back in 2007 when I gave a keynote speech from high school dropout to professor of criminology, criminal justice, the empowering aspects of U of T's academic bridging program in honor of the 40th anniversary of this Wordsworth College initiative. Well, enough about me. Tonight I'm going to discuss how ex-cons, also referred to as formerly incarcerated people, or FIs for short, can participate in reforming the field of corrections. Before proceeding, it's important to understand that some people find the term ex-con offensive, and there's a growing debate about this issue, which I'm happy to discuss, but I don't want that to distract from the paper I'm about to give, the talk I'm about to give. My talk's going to take about 40 minutes, starting from now, and if you want to discuss some or all the ideas I review, I also hope to address this during a Q&A period after the presentation. Okay, so regardless of the country, most criminal justice systems, also known as the CJS, I'm going to be using a few acronyms in my talk, and the CJS includes law enforcement, corrections, the criminal courts, also the juvenile justice system. They're complex, and they depend on a lot of resources. When we talk about resources, I'm talking about money, personnel, expertise, skills, training, coordination, that sort of thing. That's why, amongst many factors, the criminal justice system is overly complex. It's also bureaucratic. And another reason for this state of affairs is that in liberal democracies like Canada and the United States, mainly because they're governed by a constitution and the rule of law, we value things like due process, etc. Thus, there's numerous checks and balances. And that makes it difficult to operate these systems, these entities, these organizations efficiently. That being said, throughout the history of the modern criminal justice system, although these systems have periodically relied on both incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people to assist them in the management of selected elements of the agencies, when it comes time for change, improvement, innovation, reform, or transformation, I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, and I'm going to zero in on one of them in a minute here. These entities have typically relied upon the efforts of practitioners and other experts to guide them in this process. So, in this context, when we talk about experts, they've generally been scholars of penology, punishment, corrections, and from the late 19th century through the 1920s, a growing number of criminal defense lawyers, judges, jurists, and eventually academic criminologists began advocating for reforms to various components of the criminal justice system. And predictably, their influence varied across time, varied across place, but they did play a key role in shifting the system, the criminal justice system, more toward procedural fairness and modernizing it. So this approach, by using these types of experts, provided numerous benefits. Most importantly, we had expertise concentrated in a field where it could be best utilized. But over time, the arrangement was called into question, or has been called into question. Most significantly, the people who have been most affected by the criminal justice system were rarely consulted. In the 1960s, politicians, policymakers, and leaders in criminal justice agencies in Anglo-American democracies began recognizing that traditional crime control strategies focused primarily on policing and punishment had failed to reduce crime rates. They weren't going down, they were going up during the 1960s. They also acknowledged that the communities most affected by crime, along with victims themselves, had seldom been consulted about potential solutions or ways to mitigate harm. In response, we started seeing significant police-community relations efforts. We saw later the emergence of community policing and a movement closely connected with community policing called problem-oriented policing. And to a lesser extent, we started seeing victim advocates working with the criminal justice system. This process is typically referred to as the co-production or citizen co-production of criminal justice services. In short, it refers to the active involvement of ordinary people shaping, delivering, supporting justice-related services along with formal institutions like the police, like the courts, like corrections. Over time, and to a greater or lesser degree, these experiments have been institutionalized in many contexts. What does that mean? Some branches of the criminal justice system are more receptive than others to having citizen involvement in the reform practice. Also, these programs, they rise and fall in terms of popularity based on changes in leadership of criminal justice agencies, the resources that these agencies can marshal to these experiments, to these efforts, and also prevailing ideology. Before proceeding, I want to make three significant delimitations if you didn't know that this was coming already. The first is the country from which I draw my expertise. Although a similar process has occurred in Canada, I almost exclusively illustrate my talk, my argument, with information drawn from the context of the United States. Why? Well, although I have worked in Canadian universities and studied the Canadian criminal justice system, I know the American criminal justice system better. Also, second, the arguments that I present are most directly applicable to the field of corrections. Not only is this more in line with my area of expertise, but it's also the branch of the criminal justice system that appears to have made the most significant use of formerly incarcerated people in the reform process. Third, I'm going to focus on the interrelated processes of change, improvement, transformation, and reform. Now, this sounds obvious so far to you, right? But it's important to recognize the notion of reform is a contentious issue among many criminologists, prison activists, and also people who advocate prison abolition. In particular, they argue that reform ultimately maintains and protects the status quo. It means that people and systems are not looking for alternatives to traditional methods that society uses to deal with people and organizations who break the law, including the complete abolishment of prisons, police departments, etc. Also, two, in the United States, we have examples of formerly incarcerated people who have participated in the correctional and criminal justice reform. Got it right? Yes. And one of the most well-known was an ex-convict. And he was also a Columbia University professor, and his name is Frank Tenenbaum. And in the 1920s, after serving a couple of years behind bars, I think he was up in Sing Sing, he earned a doctorate, taught at Columbia, and he consulted for, among other notable targets, the Wickersham Commission, which was a very important commission, criminal justice commission in the United States. Starting in 1976, however, some jurisdictions began experimenting with using formerly incarcerated people's knowledge, skills, and experience to help with CJS reform. Some of these initiatives were derived from the victim offender reconciliation movement. A Quaker and prison abolitionist, Faye Honey Knott, helped develop this process that allowed crime victims to meet with those convicted of harming them, aiming to promote healing and accountability. The hope was that both parties, the victims and also the people who had transgressed against them, committed a crime against them, would learn from this exchange and move forward emotionally. By the 1990s, these ideas found new academic expression in the form of convict criminology. The CC approach and practice, one that I helped to co-found, initially consisted of a small group of formerly incarcerated people, individuals, and prison activists with doctorates or on their way to earning one in the field of criminal justice, criminology, or a related field. This group of individuals believed that the convict voice was either ignored or marginalized in academic discourse on criminology, criminal justice in general, and in correctional practice in particular, particularly when it came to policy debates about how to operate prisons, how to best treat people who are leaving prison, those types of contexts. They argued that this feature, the minimization of the convict voice, minimized the ability of criminology and criminal justice and corrections to best help the men and women who are behind bars and those who are about to be released and those already released and returned to society. Also, this lack of the convict voice was preventing our ability to keep community safe. Theoretically, convict criminology is anchored in the scholarly field of critical criminology and in the field of corrections. The network adopted the CC, did work around three major issues. Number one was scholarship. Number two was mentoring and teaching. Number three was service and activism. And since its founding in the mid-1990s, the network, has grown in terms of the number of people who are affiliated with it, the scholarship they've published, the mentorship they have engaged in, and the service and advocacy they've participated in. One of the nascent questions, however, is although we know quite a bit about this organization and others like it, we don't really have a stock taking of how formerly incarcerated people have helped to improve the criminal justice system in general and corrections in particular. Thus, the quick answer to my original provocative question, can ex-cons help improve the criminal justice system? The short answer is yes. However, the answer does also depend on the person, their education, the skills, which branch of the criminal justice system they've tried to assist, etc. Oh, guess what? Okay. So, three issues should be addressed before moving on. First, many formerly incarcerated individuals have entered criminal justice related careers, including the criminal law, including working as social workers, including working as addiction counselors. Others have engaged in criminal justice activism. They've found steady employment, they've found success, they've found fulfillment in these professions and pursuits. They've been able to pay their bills, support their families, assist people who are criminally charged, individuals who are incarcerated, and those who've been released from custody and or are reentering society. Second, criminal justice agencies have long excluded outsiders from criminal justice policy, practice, and reform processes. The CJS is not unique, okay? So, in many fields, practitioners and professionals, architects, dentists, lawyers, distrust outsiders, especially those who've not graduated from recognized universities, do not have appropriate certifications or licenses, nor have formal training or on-the-job experience. I mean, I'm not going to go to a dentist unless he went to a recognized dental school. Among other criticisms, many argue that FIs may not be sensitive to the day-to-day challenges they experience. Regardless, over the past 4 years, most police, corrections, and juvenile justice agencies often appear to go kicking and screaming into soliciting community participation in their affairs and the involvement of formerly incarcerated individuals. Third, formerly incarcerated individuals have been historically excluded from criminal justice reform. Formerly incarcerated people are typically distrusted because they've been convicted of breaking the law, and the stigma that surrounds these actions and them. Although most workers, leaders, and managers in the CJS, in particular the agencies, are willing to bring in legal, criminological, and law enforcement professionals, FIs have generally not been welcome. Integrating FIs into the criminal justice reform process is not without its drawbacks. First, there are concerns about objectivity and bias. First, many FIs are bitter about and appropriately so, about their experience of arrest, adjudication, and incarceration, which can influence their perspective and the proposals that they put forward to reform the criminal justice system and corrections in particular. Additionally, while their insights are rooted in personal experience, they may sometimes overgeneralize, assuming that their individual circumstances apply broadly to others who have been incarcerated. Additionally, FIs face heightened scrutiny regarding their credibility. policymakers, criminal justice practitioners, and the public may express skepticism about FI's roles in reform efforts. Such resistance is frequently framed and often pejoratively and reflecting entrenched stigmas as a concern about letting the inmates run the asylum. These tensions are deeply rooted in institutional power dynamics, including professional egos, jurisdictional competition, and a reluctance to cede control. As a result, significant effort is required to overcome the stigma and institutional resistance that can hinder meaningful inclusion of FIs into the criminal justice reform efforts. Moreover, real-world, structural, and institutional barriers impede FI's participation in the reform process. This includes, but it's not limited to, legal restrictions on hiring formerly incarcerated people in government and criminal justice policy roles. For example, many formerly incarcerated individuals may lack formal education, certification, licenses, training opportunities to transition into these positions. Let's briefly explore why incorporating FIs into the criminal justice reform process makes sense. To begin with, the lived experience of incarceration provides a type of expertise that has the potential to be used to improve the criminal justice policies, practices, and criminal laws. Formerly incarcerated individuals do possess firsthand knowledge of the criminal justice system that differs significantly from that of professionals who engage in the criminal justice system in a work setting. While practitioners typically observe the system from the outside and return home at the end of their shifts, FIs experience its impact intimately and continuously, 24 hours a day. As a result, they can offer unique insights into the system's strengths and shortcomings, particularly in areas of prison conditions, institutional practices and policies, rehabilitation efforts or the lack thereof, and the complex challenges of reentry. Additionally, FIs, formerly incarcerated individuals' work has the power to bridge the gap between theory and practice. At least in my field, too often criminological and criminal justice scholarship is divorced from the day-to-day challenges of the criminal justice system and the people who are most affected. In other words, much of the relevant scholarship is excellent in theory, but untenable in practice and implementation. And we all know people who've worked in the field for a while know the challenges of implementation, the challenge of evaluation of new policies that are proposed and attempt to be implemented in the criminal justice system. Many scholars, policymakers, and other experts don't consider the difficulties that CJ practitioners and people who are incarcerated face on a daily basis. Moreover, they have multiple and competing demands. As argued elsewhere, FIs can complement academic and practitioner knowledge. Another area where FIs can benefit the process is that they can enhance the legitimacy and trust in reforms implemented into the criminal justice system. If formerly incarcerated individuals are at the table when new policies and practices are designed, there is the possibility of a greater tendency to adopt give them more legitimacy, give those policy and practices more legitimacy because they've been vetted by people who have been formerly incarcerated. So, there are numerous examples of formerly incarcerated individuals in the United States who've participated in criminal justice reform activities in general and corrections in particular. But how can a researcher like myself develop a relatively meaningful, comprehensive, and contemporary picture of FI individuals participating in corrections policy and practice? I identified 4 possible strategies. Each has its advantages and disadvantages in terms of getting a representative sample. But the method that I relied on is based on my experiences with the Convict Criminology Network. Although I recognize the limitations of the sample, it's probably as good as any place to at least start as an illustrative example of what FI people have done to improve, transform, or reform corrections. And it may also sensitize us to things we might look for in the future if we do more research. So what are my findings here? Again, numerous examples exist of people in the criminal justice, in the CC network, Convict Criminology Network, participating in correctional change, improvement, innovation, reform, and transformation. But in order to present these examples, what I do is I break them down into the primary categories of convict criminology, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. In terms of scholarship, since the 1990s, the CC network has produced a considerable amount of scholarship in the form of peer-reviewed articles, articles in scholarly books, chapters in scholarly books, and also books themselves on subjects like prison conditions, prison education, the reentry process, and also convict criminology in particular. They've also written op-eds that have appeared in newspapers, magazines, and in blogs online. Some of them have published poetry, novellas, and zines. Some of them have even worked or done visual work and submitted it and had it displayed in art shows where the content of those pieces have a corrections-related theme. The idea behind that is it sparks a discussion that may not be easily had in other contexts. In terms of teaching and mentoring, members of the Convict Criminology Network have engaged in teaching classes in criminology and criminal justice and in corrections in particular on a part-time or a full-time basis at community colleges and also at universities at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level. They've administered or taught in educational programs behind bars, mentored numerous convicts and ex-convicts and graduate students so that they would earn a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, or even a doctorate. This includes serving as a master's thesis advisor, or a doctoral dissertation advisor. In terms of service and activism, organizing and participating on numerous panels at community forums, at academic conferences. Since the mid-1990s, at almost every American Society of Criminology meeting, there's been at least one panel and upwards of 15 panels on the subject matter of convict criminology. They've also participated in important policy debates. Selected members of the CC network have been on numerous important local, state, and national panels. Both Dan Murphy and I were on the National Institute of Medicine panels examining changes that were being implemented for the testing of pharmaceuticals using incarcerated people, made numerous recommendations, many of them ignored, but we tried our best. Giving speeches, lectures, keynotes, presentations to different constituencies, sitting on and participating on boards related directly to the criminal justice or correctional facilities, oversight boards, boards of corrections or subcommittees, serving in various capacities with corrections-related learned societies and divisions they belong to. In 1990, during the pandemic, the Convict Criminology Network formed a division of the American Society of Criminology. Many of the people who are part of the network have served on the executive, serve on special committees of that organization, acting as peer reviewers for academic journals and books, shaping the criminology and criminal justice and corrections scholarship, acting as expert witnesses in court cases that involve prisoners or people who are charged criminally, serving on editorial boards of academic journals focusing on criminology, criminal justice, corrections, serving on human subject review committees, on IRBs of universities and other organizations. A correctional facility may have an IRB, for example, serving on them. It's important to clarify the kinds of activities that are undertaken. I mean, I did mention scholarship, I did mention teaching and mentoring, I did mention service activities. First, Few members of the CC network are employed by or work directly for the criminal justice agencies. Few of them. Some of them are, but very few of them. Most have earned a doctorate in criminology and criminal justice, or on their way to earning one. As such, they're often employed in academic roles, and that presupposes the type of work that they're going to do, typically working in a university or research institution, rather than an operational role or a practitioner role within the criminal justice system. While they might be affiliated with a criminal justice agency, their primary source of employment is with a university. To better conceptualize this involvement, I thought that maybe we could look at involvement two ways. One being direct versus indirect. In terms of direct involvement, this includes hands-on engagement with the criminal justice system, such as working in or for a correctional agency, participating in efforts to reform or improve conditions within prisons and jails while employed by a Department of Corrections, delivering in-prison educational rehabilitative programs. Those sorts of activities are less done by people in the Convict Criminology Network. Their participation is more in the, what I would call more indirect involvement. Again, producing academic scholarship, serving on advisory boards, advocacy organizations, consulting for justice-related nonprofits, doing work in criminal cases. Viewing these forms of involvement on a continuum is also helpful. So it's not so monolithic, and I'll return to this idea in a second. Ranging from activities that are highly immersive, where you would be a correctional practitioner, resource-intensive work, to more peripheral or occasional engagements. And I'll talk about this in a second too. Within each category, whether we're talking indirect or indirect, activities can be rank ordered in terms of intensity. Referred here, and one could operationalize that based on how much of a person's time and energy, resources are dedicated to those pursuits. After all, as a university professor, you have to teach, you have to do scholarship. So that's a given. The question is what you do your research and scholarship on is, in many respects, for you to decide. That being said, the previously chronicled activities, which I mentioned, by individuals in the CC network have brought multiple benefits to these activities. First, they've provided grounded insights into what works and what doesn't in correctional environments and post-incarceration policies, practices, programs. They've also advocated for policies and practices that affect the daily lives of people who are incarcerated. The men and women who are behind bars and confront systematic barriers to reentry. Additionally, members of the CC network have helped raise awareness to the principles and practices promoted by CC. Most importantly, many have emerged as a credible alternative to mainstream criminology, actively mentoring both in the classroom and on prison tiers while advancing a distinct vision of justice. Just as an aside, almost every week I get an email or I get a letter from somebody behind bars asking about things like education behind bars or post-incarceration possibilities for education. And I'm not alone. Many of the people who are in the network, this is the kind of unseen kind of service we do on a regular basis. We are, as they call it, credible messengers. A full accounting of the contribution doesn't exist and may not really be possible given the breadth and decentralized nature of people who are part of the convict criminology approach. Although my talk cataloged a whole bunch of different types of participation by men and women affiliated with the Convict Criminology Network, admittedly, the data does have shortcomings. To start, I haven't gathered information on key issues such as the duration of participants' contributions, the challenges that they faced, or the impact that these activities had on their lives, or the participants or the organizations they dealt with. For example, many convict criminology members in the network have told me that criminal justice work has been helpful to themselves and the constituencies they serve, while others have told me that their participation just seemed like window dressing, okay? And criminal justice agencies were just kind of checking the box. Yes, we have somebody who's formerly incarcerated, somebody who has lived experience helping us out in this small particular policy challenge. Others have confided me that they contributed to one or more previously mentioned activities, but once the objective was satisfied, they decreased the frequency with which they engaged. In the field of scholarship, some people start after they reach a promotion level, be it tenure, be it associate professor. They taper off on their productivity for one reason or another. They've also told me that the organization they work with or for gave the impression that they were very happy with their participation, but they didn't feel like they really had a voice. And alternatively, at the very end, their input was ignored. The next logical question is, where do we go from here? In many cases, the examples I presented were sufficient. However, if there's a demonstrated need to examine some or all the contributions as I outlined above, then I might need to consider the possibility of doing a more formal survey and tapping into the handful of organizations that have emerged in the United States that are advocating on behalf of formerly incarcerated individuals that are run by formerly incarcerated individuals. The question is, what value added will a study of this kind provide for the amount of resources to be expended? So there you have it. I've reviewed a handful of the drawbacks and contributions of involving formerly incarcerated individuals in reforming, transforming, and helping to change the criminal justice system, in particular corrections. I've outlined these activities, the people who are part of the network that I'm most familiar with, the Convict Criminology Network, where a disproportion of the members are formerly incarcerated. And I've made a few comments about how we might analyze these contributions and how to understand this activity. To be sure, formerly incarcerated people are not a monolithic group. Some bring significant expertise in specific domains, while others may contribute primarily through their lived experience. Some are very good at translating their experiences to others. Others may have difficulty doing it. As such, effective and balanced reform efforts should integrate the insights of I believe that effective and balanced reform efforts need to integrate the insights of formerly incarcerated people alongside those of respective and effective academics and practitioners in the field of criminology and criminal justice. I hope that this reflection has helped clarify the specific roles that FIs can play in efforts to reform the criminal justice system and corrections in particular, including innovation efforts, transformation efforts, reform efforts. They certainly lend a diverse perspective in terms of trying to understand and propose solutions, leading to perhaps a more humane, not just simply a more effective, but also a more humane policies, practices, perhaps even criminal laws. But there is a danger. The danger is co-optation. The danger is also burnout. There's also the danger of what we call carceral logic and the maintenance of the system. And building on the CC tradition, one area where FIs may be most impactful is providing instruction to undergraduate and graduate students. You have to realize that in your typical undergraduate class in criminology and criminal justice, a lot of them are either practitioners or want to be practitioners. And you have an opportunity to provide them with insights about what they might expect in the field. This is where the principles of convict criminology, centering on the insights of those who've lived through the system, perhaps are most relevant and, I would argue, most powerful. I want to thank you for being very patient with me, and hopefully we can talk about some of these ideas in a Q&A. And I'll turn things over to Scott.
Thank you, Professor. That was wonderful and insightful, and I'm sure we can have a really interesting conversation. Raised a lot of issues. Can you guys hear me? I'm not used to this kind of setup here. I've always wanted to be a talk show host, and this is my opportunity. I kind of feel like Dr. Phil or something.
This is a start of a partnership. We should do a podcast.
Yeah, well, we've already been introduced as a couple, so we could start doing that now. There's so many places to start, but I understand as a Canadian, you've been living in the States for a couple of decades now. And I guess what Canadians want to know is, Trump serious about making us the 51st state, or are there any insights on that? Just joking. I want to start with one of the big questions that actually is related to the new administration. You've mentioned that since the 1960s, there's been a lot of progressive movement within criminology and criminal justice, including the development of convict criminology and the inclusion of formerly incarcerated persons in reform efforts. Do you think when we transition to more right-wing governments that there is a threat that progress is going to be undermined? We've seen it, with respect to anti-racism movements within the justice system in the States and DEI movements. What's your feeling about how a massive change in administration might hurt things like funding and even the ability for former inmates to work within the system?
Thanks for the question. That's a great question. Is this working? Yeah, perfect. Appropriate, perfect. If one is to analyze the current Trump administration, one might look at what he did during the first term. And you alluded to some of the things that were happening during the first term. So I think that resources for criminal justice are going to increase in the following way. There's going to be more money for police officers, for correctional officers, certainly more money for private prisons. We're seeing the private prison industry just boom right now, particularly in terms of detentions that may be relied upon when people are sent out of the United States. In terms of we've seen right now in the Department of Justice, we've seen positions being cut. The research arm that I used to work for, the National Institute of Justice, which is the largest research arm of the Department of Justice, they canceled all grants and contracts as around the same time that they canceled almost all contracts coming from or out of NIH. So in terms of new research on criminal justice, which would possibly look to pro-social reforms, I think that's suspended for the balance of his term. Whether or not we're going to see more people engaging with formerly incarcerated people or more formerly incarcerated people being active, it's hard to say. I mean, there's a very strong protest movement in the United States. People feel like I think some of the promises that he made to them are not materializing, particularly when there's cutbacks in social services, Social Security, that sort of thing. What else? There were a couple of topics here that you mentioned that I probably glossed over. Help me out.
Well, we're mentioning the DEI, the anti-bias movement being undercut at the moment. Okay, yeah, sorry.
I mean, certainly that's things are slipping back, sliding back to an era that was during the 1960s. But some of the unusual things during the first Trump administration was they did manage to pass a relatively comprehensive reentry, I thought it was a reentry type bill. I forget all the component parts of that reentry bill. And the fact that President Trump is a convicted criminal now may have some sort of bearing on how he treats people who are formerly incarcerated. He's certainly, let considerable number of people out of, gave pardons to a considerable number of people who I would say the majority of the public, including large number of criminal justice practitioners, thought was unconscionable. Anything's on the table, I think, and which makes things all the more confusing and also in many respects debilitating at the same time.
The impact of the new administration on correctional reform might be as unpredictable as the impact on the stock market.
Indeed, indeed. And about a week ago, he, what did he do with the correctional officer union? I think he I don't know if it's outlawed. He certainly clipped its wings. There's a federal correctional officer union that he, I think, is trying to disband. That's not a good sign. I don't think you want to clip the wings of a criminal justice the rank and file of a criminal justice agency, because they're not going to do their job properly.
It's important to note that, with switches between administrations, that similar programs have been cut in Canada in the not too recent past. One important program that existed within the federal correctional system for years was called the Lifers Program. And these were formerly incarcerated individuals who had actually served a life sentence. So they had a great deal of experience within corrections and had a great deal of experience reintegrating into society after a long absence. And this group did fantastic work. One of the tasks they engaged in was helping people getting life sentences adjust to the prison environment, letting them know what their life was going to be like within the institution and helping them adjust to that reality. Their second major task was helping those who had served an extended period of time upon release, helping them, learn how to get an apartment, how to get a job, how to use an ATM machine, and serving as a source of support when they struggled upon reintegration. The Harper government came in and completely wiped out the program and argued that ex-criminals should not be benefiting financially from their criminal histories. I'm sure those types of challenges to these programs have been provided in the States?
Well, yeah, I think it's on a state-by-state basis. In the United States, there's about 2.2 million people who are behind bars, with about 4 million people who are on probation or parole, and the majority of people who are incarcerated in state prison systems, state and local prison systems. So, at the federal level, there's only so much that Trump can do with prisons, and it would be the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And it's a different type of criminal charge that somebody has committed to be sentenced to a federal prison. And there are these similar types of programs where lifers do come into the prisons. At least I know in the state of California they've had a very strong program. But I'm sure this may be on his agenda. This may be on the Department of Justice's agenda. I mean, I think there's going to be a tightening of screws, no question about it. And so much, I mean, the courts are working overtime. And I think what we're seeing, this is just the beginning. I think right now there's about 200 lawsuits already filed against the Trump administration. And it seems like, the Trump administration is saying, bring it on. So it'll be, I don't want to say it'll be a lot. It'll be a lot of fun over the next 4 years, but it'll certainly be interesting, for lack of a better word, for all sorts of reasons.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to switch topics a little bit. One of the topics that you raised with respect to FI scholarship has to do with objectivity. And I was thinking about this, knowing that your talk was coming up, and I was at a meeting with a large number of police institutions and wanting to engage in what they were referring to as evidence-based policing. And there was a large proportion of support for former police officers who had gone on and got an MA or a PhD and were now either professors or consultants. And a lot of the argument was they are going to be better police scholars because they have worn the badge. They have engaged with the community. They have engaged with the criminal element. And I personally felt very uncomfortable with this because I thought, if anything, they might have a lack of objectivity in terms of critically viewing their profession. So to what extent, if you can elaborate on that, and a related question is, we often hear this, I will be able to connect with the police officers were saying, I'll be able to connect with other police officers, we'll be able to get a better rapport, we'll be able to therefore get superior information and insights from them because they're not going to talk to you. Has there been any evidence that, for instance, FI scholars have been able to produce data that, let's say, non-FI scholars would have been able to produce?
A great question. I've heard the argument you put forward of having former practitioners, that somehow former practitioners who get advanced degrees will be in a better position to communicate with or do better research than individuals who have the same training. I've heard that before, and it's an interesting argument, and it's, like you say, it's similar to the argument that somehow formerly incarcerated people with advanced degrees will be better able to connect with individuals behind bars. And I think as unsatisfactory as my response is going to be, is that it depends. It depends. Some are better than others in connecting with their target audience. There are better and worse researchers with or without practitioner and or lived experience. And the evidence is, or it all comes out in the wash. When they complete their study or studies, their research, and it's put in front of some sort of when it's adjudicated by an external audience, as in peer review, which is the gold standard that people in academia use to evaluate the quality of their work. Does it fly? And if it flies, it flies. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Certainly there's issues of reactivity with your subject. There's issues of bias. I mean, I think it's present in both of them. And I think it's important to acknowledge, formerly incarcerated individuals, the potential for them to do research in the field that they have intimate connection with, similarly to having former criminal justice practitioners who now have, bachelor's, master's, and doctorates. But they may not be efficacious in doing what we hope they can do.
It's a little bit of a different example, but an example where sometimes the barriers can go up if you're coming. There's the argument of credibility and rapport, and being better able to communicate in a language that can resonate with the research subject, knowing your subject. But at the same time, there's, under certain circumstances, it can backfire. And recently we've been doing a study, in the northwest quadrant of Toronto, with disadvantaged kids who have been involved in the criminal justice system. And the first thought was that we were going to hire people from the community, some individuals who had been involved in the justice system in the past, to do the research because they were going to have more credibility, more comfort. And we found in the end it was the opposite. And one of the reasons was because they were from the same community. They didn't want to divulge sensitive aspects of their life because they felt that person could go talk to people in the community. So there was a discomfort. I know that guy. I see that guy on the street. I'm not going to tell him private aspects of my life because of the worry about confidentiality. So that was one example of where the from a logical point of view, you think it's going to work, but it can backfire under certain circumstances because of familiarity.
I've never heard of an example like that, but that makes perfect sense. Why would I reveal something that I've done that may be deviant or illegal to somebody who lives in my neighborhood? Why should he or she? What's in it for him or her, right? I don't completely trust that person now, right? So in having formerly incarcerated individuals do research in prisons, one of the things is the best scenario is that they're not doing research in the same prison. They're doing it in a research in a prison that they never served time in. They don't know the people behind bars. It's in a different state, a neighboring state, different jurisdiction. I would think that in general that increases cooperation. But that's an excellent example.
Yeah, there's so many other issues to tap into. One of the issues that was mentioned, is the aspect of reintegration, and the role that formerly incarcerated people who have been successful on the outside reintegrating might play in assisting those, because it's a very underdeveloped aspect of our justice system. We spend a lot of money on policing, we spend a lot of money on corrections, there's a lot of rehabilitative programming within correctional facilities, but in many cases it stops at the door and is much less formalized, much less funded. At this crucial moment when the sentence is over, the punishment is over, and the person must be reintegrated. Do you see that as a particularly promising area for formerly incarcerated persons?
Yes, I see it more though through the lens of the convict criminology, the people and the things that we've done in convict criminology, and that is we've on many campuses you will have a group now, a student group of formerly incarcerated people who help to temper the alienation that students may feel, formerly incarcerated students may feel on campus, particularly on large campuses. So if they, you may have a veterans group, you may have a First Nations group. Well, you have a formerly incarcerated group, and formerly incarcerated people can help these individuals navigate the university bureaucracy. And by the way, putting in a pitch here for formerly incarcerated individuals as students, many of them, if they've spent time behind bars, they're dedicated students. They study on a regular basis. They go to the library on a regular basis. They don't leave things to the last minute unless they may have families to support, children to support, and a job that they have to travel to the other end of the city to work in, to pay bills. But generally speaking, if they get into a residence, and they have a meal plan, they excel. We've seen numerous examples of people like that in our network. But there is a role for formerly incarcerated people to assist others like themselves, and it's to lend a helping hand to somebody else who've been similarly affected, to kind of play it forward, and that's we see a lot of that in this community.
I've got a couple of other questions before we can open it up to the audience to ask questions. One of the questions is, you mentioned this kind of tension sometimes between some reformist movements, particularly abolitionists, who would argue that any form of activity that is going to reify, the status quo. So it's, the idea of formerly incarcerated individuals coming into the prison is really just, in many ways, as you would mention, window dressing. They're going to provide kind of a verification of the good work that is being done within a corrupt system. And I'm reminded at the center, we had a talk the other week from an individual who, of Indigenous background, who was supportive of Indigenous programming within Canadian prisons, which is very well developed, and talking about the criticisms that these programs had received from the abolitionist movement, who were arguing that this was only supporting the system. And his own research actually went out and interviewed Indigenous inmates about the impact that the Indigenous programming was having on their quality of lives and outlook, and most of those findings were positive. How do you address that tension between those who want to reform the system or work, I hate to use the term practical, but within more narrow limits to improve the quality of those in the system, and the tension that exists between those who want to totally reform it or change it completely?
Great question. And again, I'm going to say that this tension, I hate to use this word again, but it's interesting, really. This tension between, liberals and conservatives and activists, prison activists and, reformists, and, there's, one size does not fit all. And I think, it's important to engage with people who have, different opinions about corrections or criminal justice. But the bottom line is, I think in many respects, some empirical evidence. And, we can always find anecdotes of success stories. And I'm guilty as charged. But I think, and there's positive aspects about the prison abolition movement. And back in 1983, I was a freelance reporter covering the story of the very first prison abolition conference that took place in Toronto. And I thought that the prison abolition movement had a lot of interesting points. The good thing about the prison abolition movement and many of its suggestions is it forces us to confront punishment as the single most preferred alternative to dealing with people who break the law or people who engage in deviance. It forces us to confront, what is really, bad about a particular action, behavior, and does the punishment fit the crime? And it can push for reforms. So it's not an outlier, but it's an extreme. And I think we've seen that too since as part of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, and people calling for the abolition of police departments. It's forcing us to really confront issues about law enforcement and policing, not just police use of excessive force or unsavory police practices, but where police departments are actually, spending their money, and so it's a signpost. It's a not necessarily a limitation, but I think it's enabling. I'm not sure I answered your question. I did answer it.
You did. Somehow. And the last point I'm going to bring out is as with many issues, there's positive and negative aspects of it. And I was thinking about your talk today as we've been looking at some results from a study we did where we interviewed over 300 self-identified gang members or former gang members. And one of the things that we asked about was what needs to be done to reduce violence on the street. But we also asked what are your thoughts of, what do you want to do in the future? How do you want to engage with mainstream society? And an exceptionally high proportion of these primarily young men said they wanted to start a program because they have, often I have street credibility now, and I want to start a program to help other young people stay out of this lifestyle. And that I could use my lived experience and translate this into messages to mentor kids. And indeed, there's many programs in Toronto that are run by former gang members who proudly state their background and can make a decent living running these programs. So on the one hand, it was kind of heartening to see that this was a career option, but also the high volume of young men who saw that as their main option and how realistic that ultimately was. There's going to be some who are going to be good entrepreneurs and good self-promote who are going to get the government funds to run these programs, and there's going to be others who are going to fail. So do you think it's a good thing that formerly incarcerated individuals or individuals who were formerly involved in gangs are looking towards this as a career option? Or does that say something about the sad state of affairs for those who have been stigmatized by a criminal record, that they're viewing their only options as something within the justice system?
Also a good observation, good question. I mean, in the United States, there are similar kinds of programs in different jurisdictions. In Baltimore and Washington, they have these violence interrupters. These people who go in the street, who know, gang members or young men who are wannabes, and they get to know them. They get into the high schools, and they try to disrupt the possibility of violence that usually results in the United States in some sort of gun violence. So formerly incarcerated people, individuals, former gang members, this is probably, this is a good thing. But some of them are going to see it as a hustle, and some of them are going to, we've seen this in Baltimore, that some of them have eventually been charged with drug possession, drug trafficking, but not all of them. So you're going to see a certain percentage of them, and we have to be careful in every jurisdiction, regardless of the United States, or Canada, is that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And right-wing, there's a right-wing conservative tendency to do that. Somebody's arrested, somebody gets hurt, somebody gets shot, and then next thing you know, they close down the whole program. In London, England, Oxford University ran a program for formerly incarcerated individuals. I actually was incarcerated. It was similar to a Inside Out program, which is when you have undergraduates go to correctional facilities. They take one or more undergraduate classes inside a correctional facility alongside inmates. And they had a similar program run through Oxford University. However, inmates were allowed out of the correctional facility, and there was an event that took place in London, and it led to a tragic death of about 2 or 3 people. One of the individual was the perpetrator, was actually killed by a formerly incarcerated individual who grabbed this like a whalebone or something like that, hit him. But so Oxford University, what do? They shut down the program, and then the Ministry of Corrections shuts down all similar programs. So that's a sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater without really looking at the individual program and seeing the security concerns that were addressed or not addressed, and making reforms, changes based on an evaluation like that. So, for what it's worth, these programs must be monitored, evaluated by people who are capable of doing, these, process and implementation type evaluations, so that they get it right. And they're not going to get it right, the first time and always. And there's always going to be flaws. But again, cooler heads should prevail, and people who are thoughtful should be running these programs, et cetera, et cetera.
Unfortunately, there's so many examples of promising programs, effective programs that are terminated for various reasons. I'm thinking about a really highly successful program that was run at Collins Bay Penitentiary in Kingston, and it was a computer programming a program where they could get a college degree. So it was the same instructors and the same degree that they were getting at the local college. So there was a 2-year degree, highly successful, very popular with those who were enrolled, a waiting list of incarcerated men who wanted to take the program. And it was eventually shut down because the parents of the kids at the I think it's Loyalist College, were complaining that they were now competing with criminals who didn't have the right to get the same degree for free, because of, so the complaint was along the lines of, my child is now competing against, and we're paying tuition to this school for the same degree that they're getting in prison for free, even though, my child has never broken the law or engaged in crime. So these are some of the political realities. I think we've got 2 mics in either aisle. If anybody would has a question for our speaker, please put up your hand, and one of the mics will come down to you. Please wait until the mic comes before I answer your questions. Pardon?
I got a big booming voice.
Okay, but we still need the mic. So
I'd like to ask, there's a prison for profit. Has that eroded your program? In the States.
has
Governments have had privatized prisons. Has this eroded the program and limited what your innovations have done over a period of time?
Okay, so if I'm interpreting you correctly, what's the effect of private prisons on the kind of the convict criminology, movement or network? I don't think it's had much. I only know one individual who is in the network who spent a considerable amount of time in a private facility, and he's actually a well-respected scholar. I don't think it has had much effect. But this is definitely the way of the future in many liberal democracies. Private prisons have shown governments that they can manage a prison population with cheaper than government-run prisons. And I've been in two private prisons in 2 different jurisdictions. Toured them. A colleague who's since released was in one of them and talked about the conditions there. But there's serious flaws with private prisons, and in terms of health care, in terms of safety, both for correctional officers and for inmates. They don't put anybody in general, no one who is a very violent inmate is put to is housed in a private prison. And it's not just, you know, Canada, the United States, the UK, Australia. We see them in Latin America, South America, and in Europe, the influx of private prisons. So,
And you know, right now there's still a relatively small proportion of all prisons. I think a lot of the negative impact would emerge once they've got control of the market, so to speak. I mean, I think the biggest issue with respect to privatizing prisons is that their goal is often different from what the public wants. You know, I think what the public wants is an effective correctional system that is going to reduce crime, reduce fear of crime, increase public safety. That's not necessarily what business wants. Business wants growth. Business wants stability. And I think that is one of the, you know, the biggest fundamental philosophical differences between public and private institutions. I think there was a question over here. Yes, and then over here.
Is it on? Oh, it is. Thank you. So I'm thinking about the folks who are coming in that are formerly incarcerated who are coming to educational spaces. And typically when we think about, you know, people who have been incarcerated for longer periods of time, they have more difficulty coming back into society and accessing services such as like employment or housing or various different things. And so do you find that the people who are formerly incarcerated who are entering these education spaces, is there a lot of diversity in terms of like the crimes that they've committed or, you know, the length that they might have been incarcerated for? Or do you typically have people that might have shorter sentences, who might have further access to supports than people who might be incarcerated for longer periods of time?
I'm assuming this, okay, so good question. I can't answer your question as well as it should be answered. I do know that type of crime has a big effect on how the individual is perceived as a student. Many people are uncomfortable with having someone who has been convicted of a sex-related crime, also a violent crime, particularly a violent crime that might be murder, and also the circumstances under which that crime occurred. Some people would rather, you know, have in their study group somebody who was a corporate criminal, you know, or a white-collar criminal than somebody who committed a crime under very gruesome circumstances that you can get details on by doing a very simple, you know, web-based search and get access to, you know, court records and all that sort of thing. So certainly the longer the time somebody's been behind bars, the tougher it is to adjust. But there's also those other factors too that I mentioned too, you know, the competing pressures they may have. You know, in the United States, if you have been convicted of a crime and you are released, there are very little supports for you. You may not be entitled to public housing. You may not be entitled to certain educational benefits. Clearly, in the United States, they took away Pell Grants, then Obama put them back. I'm not sure what happened under the first Trump administration with respect to Pell Grants. I think they may have been untouched. I have a feeling that they're going to be removed very shortly if they haven't already during the second Trump administration. Pell Grants enabled individuals who are incarcerated to pay for university education. Now the question then becomes is how are they going to get university education behind bars? During the Obama administration, many universities started teaching classes in state facilities. And so so the question is, what are they going to be left with? Correspondence type universities. Then there's issues of internet connection too, blah blah blah. So yeah, it's a kind of a big mess. Yeah.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. I am a formerly incarcerated person myself who is now, among other things, doing volunteer work in this field, including editing a blog for the John Howard Society of Canada, blog on criminal justice issues. And in the course of that, I use a lot of work done by scholars in Canada and elsewhere. My question is this: we're in the middle of a federal election campaign in which the commitments being made on criminal justice seem very far from the evidence. And I wonder, I'd ask both of you perhaps to comment on this. Why is criminal justice a field where we have some pretty good evidence, which we consistently not just ignore, but do the opposite of?
I tell my students, nobody, well, in the United States, they have something called the death penalty. I'm sure you've heard of it. You know, every few years, there's a state decides to do something like have a moratorium on the death penalty and then eventually get rid of the death penalty. In my, 25 or so years teaching at University of Baltimore, I've been on death row. I'm sorry, I walked along the tiers of death row, but it's about, say, 10 years ago, Martin O'Malley, the governor, abolished it, or he led the campaign to abolish it. I forget what he needed to do to abolish it, but where am I going with this? Okay, so I tell my students that no politician got elected being soft on crime or against the death penalty in a death penalty state. So, and I also tell them too that despite having great research done on many issues in the criminal justice system, policing, courts, juvenile justice system, that doesn't always get in front of the eyes of policymakers, practitioners, and even if it did get in front of them, it doesn't mean that they would act upon it in a way that was meaningful. And then even if a policy is converted into a law, doesn't mean that that law is enacted in a manner that is meaningful. So we have numerous examples of this happening in the criminal justice system. I'm sure that's happening in the educational, social service system too. There are even, like a cohort of criminal justice researchers who kind of do research on all the great research that's been produced, but when it came time for it to be enacted into law, there was so much slippage. So so criminal justice is a highly politicized entity, and that's why you're not seeing lots of good research being implemented.
I do think, in the Canadian context and in the American context, it's fascinating being a criminology professor because unlike other disciplines, the students come in already with very strong opinions that they know the justice system, that it's common sense. And I find a lot of it is their digestion of media, movies, TV, and how the crime is covered in the news. Sensationalistic stories, if it bleeds, it leads. Contributes to a very narrow vision and very strong views about what is right and what works and what should work. So you often hear people saying it's just common sense, right? Deterrence is going to work. It's just common sense. But they're based on very little actual information. And I think you've probably noticed that students change their mind after being actually exposed to criminological research. And I don't think criminologists themselves, do a great job of communicating the facts. Some do, some don't, to a general public. There's a lot of communication to each other through peer-reviewed journals, through the academic discipline. But translating that into something that can be digested by the wider public is really difficult. If you're a pharmacist, you can make a pill and you say, take the pill, you'll get better. Communicating kind of social science facts about criminology and what works with respect to punishment is a much more difficult task, and many shy away from it. I can actually sell my class. We've got a new class with, starting with 500 students called True Crime, media depictions of crime and justice versus criminological research, where we're going to try to challenge these types of things for first year students. But I do think that politicians gravitate, towards those sensationalistic cases. The first Bush administration with Governor Dukakis used the Willie Horton case to argue for tougher crimes. Today, Poilievre came out saying that he's going to bring in 3 strikes and you're out laws to Canada and reduce bail, both which have been proven disastrous in the United States. But they resonate with people who want some form of justice or think that, and I also think there's a huge exaggeration about how dangerous the world is. I mean, my students, when they come in, they think Toronto is like a hotbed of crime and violence. And I'm just reminded my dad, who passed away a couple of years ago, lived in Ottawa, and he was convinced that murders took place every day in Ottawa. And I would say, well, actually, Dad, there was 17 all of last year. But his view of because he would watch the news and listen to these stations, that there was talk about murder every day. If it wasn't Ottawa, it was someplace else. And this resonates with this grassroots and politicians. One final point, though, and I thought it was excellent, that sometimes what politicians promise don't translate into actual policies. Harper was famous for wanting to toughen the youth justice system in Canada. That the sentences were too light, so he brought in the YCGA, and he promised parts of the YCGA, for instance, allow youth to be given an adult sentence, and this was huge. People think, wow, this is getting tough. Under that legislation, our youth incarceration rate has gone from one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, youth incarceration rates, to one of the lowest. And our youth population that's incarcerated has been cut by 75%. That's not how it was sold, though. It was sold as we're getting tough on youth crime. So, yes, and then we'll try on the other side over here too.
Thank you, Professor Ross, for your talk and your comments about what people promise and how implementation actually happens has allowed me, I hope, to ask Professor Wortley a question. It's about 20 years since the Ontario Systemic Racism Commission report. Many of us, I think, in the room worked in corrections then and see it now, and I'd invite you to comment on what do you think was a really successful change out of that has stuck, and where do we continue to fail dismally in fixing the kinds of things where the evidence says we need to change?
Thanks for the question. Over the first 20 years since the commission, I would say very little changed at all. If anything, it got worse. There was a refusal to conduct research on issues of racial bias within the justice system, a refusal to collect data that would help us explore issues like, does sentencing vary by race, or do police practices vary by race? I have seen more reform, at least peripherally, over the last 5 years than I have in the previous 20. Primarily because now governments are going to start collecting data, race-based data, to look at differential outcomes across different groups. We've never had that before. There's a worry that I think some institutions will take that to try to argue it's crime, it's race and crime, the relationship, and misuse the data. But I think the potential now for those to actually monitor and evaluate these programs. In the past, I think the biggest thing that was introduced in terms of a recommendation is widespread anti-bias, anti-racism training. But I think, does it have an impact? I don't know, because they don't evaluate it. Most race relations training within the system is a box to take. You've got to take that course. You don't have to demonstrate any knowledge. You don't have to pass a test. I've always commented that the Ontario Police College, to become a police officer, you have to swim 2 lengths of an Olympic pool. And you actually have to do that or you won't become a police officer. However, you just have to be present for the race relations class and check the box. That communicates, I think, to police officers what is important and what is not important. So the long run, I don't think there's been major changes. I think we still have the same issues throughout the system. The only thing that is a little bit more promising is there seems to be a little more willingness to study it and focus on it. So that would be an optimistic but pessimistic statement at the same time. So, sorry. I think we've got someone on this side of the room.
Hello. I wanted to ask, do you feel that the pressure to intellectualize the experience of incarceration impacts the access of formerly incarcerated people to impact the criminal justice system?
Are you asking me?
Generally, either of you who wants to answer.
Yeah. The simple answer is no. I'm not sure what more I can add to that question.
The only thing I can add sometimes in terms of the intellectualization of research findings is, I've sometimes found within social science in general and criminology in particular, there's ways of mystifying the message that academics do. I find from the qualitative side, it's often mystification through complex language, big words, insider terminology that is often, used. I mean, I can't read Foucault sometimes just because I can't follow the terminology. And then the quantitative side will mystify things through advanced statistics and that kind of, in some ways, I think is supposed to give credibility to the discipline that this is true science. But as I said earlier, we've got to find a way of communicating those findings in a language that can reach a broader range of people. And I think convict criminology has largely been one of the more successful frames within criminology to be able to communicate to broader audiences. Other forms of more traditional criminology and social science, however, still engage in that intellectual academic discourse that is only available to insiders. So.
My apology if I know my answer was very short, and it took me off guard, but I think, and thanks Scott for giving me the space to think through my thoughts and my reactions. And Scott's right in the sense that I think the people who have been part of the convict criminology network have tried to demystify as much as possible a lot of, I'd say, language and scholarship around corrections. And starting in the 1990s, in many journals, we saw how can I put it tactfully? I'll say an interest in Foucault, an interest in a lot of concepts that were being used to understand what happens behind bars. And we found this kind of approach to be the intellectualization of the correctional experience. And in some respects, convict criminology was a break from that. We also found too, despite our roots in critical criminology, we found that a lot of critical criminological interpretations of the carceral experience, of reentry, of corrections in general were very simplistic. We were also, and when it comes to the prison abolition movement, we were very cautious about many of the underpinnings of the prison abolition movement because Many of the people, I want to say this tactfully and carefully too, is that we did not get a sense that a lot of people who were advocating prison abolition had spent much time on a tier, you know, either as a correctional practitioner or, you know, as formerly incarcerated, and there's these other types of, there's these other levels of commitment or people who are part of the network. There are people who are system contacted, system involved. These are people who may have been charged with a criminal offense, they may have been sentenced, but they weren't incarcerated. Okay, so they have a level of knowledge. They may be system, I forget which I get these levels confused. They may have a loved one, a son, daughter, father, partner who was incarcerated, and they went to court with them every day. We have, you know, a good friend who traveled across the country every weekend to visit their incarcerated loved ones. And so to suggest that they have not been impacted in some way and have some unique insights that may benefit the field of criminology, criminal justice, and corrections is short-sighted. I'm not sure, again, if I've answered your question in a satisfactory manner, but
I think we have time for one more question. I know you've been waiting for a while. Thank you for your patience.
Dr. Ross, I'd be very interested in hearing some of the recommendations that the formerly incarcerated are making for improvement in the system.
That's a great question. There are two articles, both of which I've co-authored, and I cannot remember all recommendations off the top of my head, but clearly providing more rehabilitative programs inside correctional facilities, not just more, but better. Also, better conditions inside, better access to health care inside, and better reentry services, reentry services when they're released. You've heard these horror stories of people being released from prison in the United States with $20 on a bus ticket. That's true, and there are just ridiculously poorly underfunded correctional systems in the United States, particularly in the poor states, in the South. Most correctional systems there, they've cut back, they continue to cut back on the money they spend per prisoner on conditions. One of the things too is, and you've heard this in recent years, because of the decrepit prison conditions, they don't have air conditioners, particularly in southern prisons, particularly because we have climate change that's happening in the world, and the southern states, even northern states, are now feeling the impact of this. So, and there are bills that are sitting in state legislatures allocating appropriate levels of funding that governors have decided not to sign to renovate correctional facilities in states like, I think, Texas, maybe even Florida. So prisoners are suffering, prisoners are dying. Yes, you may argue, well, don't do the crime if you don't do, don't do. You should have thought twice about doing the crime. I was trying to remember the expression.
Isn't a song from Beretta? Don't do the crime if you can't do the time.
Yeah, right. Don't do the time if you ain't got. Don't do the crime if you ain't got the time. Yeah, that's right. So, but there's I'd be happy to share with you the articles and so on and so forth. They're common sense proposals. There's nothing super liberal or radical about many of the proposals we're putting forward. and there's good, scholarly evidence to support these proposals. There's just, at least in many jurisdictions in the United States, there's an unwillingness to go forward with them. And there's a highly punitive component of many parts of the United States in terms of the culture. So this does not bode well for many people who are charged with a crime, people who are convicted of a crime and sentenced. So.
So for those of you who have been to an alumni lecture before, we always end with comment from a student who is an Innis, who will be a future Innis alum, but is currently a student. So today we have Esther Ogunsanya, who is a fourth-year criminology student and also an East Asian student, and she is going to wrap us up. So, Esther.
Hi, everyone. I just want to start off by saying thank you all for coming today. This is actually my first time in Innis Hall, but I want to thank you all for making it a very engaging and stimulating experience. I also want to extend my thanks to Dr. Ross for your talk today. I think one of the things that stood out to me was your discussion of the impact of lived experiences as a form of expertise. I'm thinking back to my time in the criminology department, and I think some of the most impactful articles that I've read have been from individuals who were formerly incarcerated, not just because they talked about abolition, but because they pointed out the smaller ways that carceral logic plays a role in our life, like the use of dangerous offender levels and how that impacts people actually within the prisons, in ways that I don't think I would have thought about if I wasn't learning it from somebody who had actually experienced those things. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to reflect on that, and I want to let you know that I will be taking it with me even as I leave the department. So thank you.